What's up guys, welcome back to Car Studio. I had to film this intro really quick to this video because it was kind of a last minute video and I didn't really plan on making it, but I had to address one of the biggest problems in the world today, at least in the United States. And I don't like getting into politics, especially with my content, but we need to talk about brake jobs. So dealerships and indie shops have been charging way too much to change people's brakes for years now, and it just keeps going up. And here's the thing, changing your brake pads is not much more labor intensive or requires more talent than changing your oil does. And in this video I'm going to show you how changing brakes and rotors literally takes 15 minutes per wheel. Why are you guys taking your cars to shops and paying hundreds of dollars? So let me break it down to you. Let's talk about the cost of parts. So for brake pads on your average car, and really any car except for, higher end, performance cars or luxury cars, brake pads range from 20 to around 50 bucks at your local parts store. So that's for, let's just say the front. And then the rear is typically less, sometimes a little more, but still falls within that range. So right there you have at max $100 in parts for your brake pads. Let's go to rotors. Rotors range from $35 to $70. And that's per rotor. There's obviously 4 rotors, unless your car has rear drum brakes. So now you're getting into at max $300. Again, that's high end on your rotors. $300 for rotors. So all in all, $400 in parts. Again, this is absolutely the best parts and replacing all 4 brakes and rotors. $400 in parts. If you take your vehicle to a shop, it's going to cost 3 times that much, easily. Now on your average vehicle, you go to the parts store, you buy your brake pads. Realistically, they cost about 30 bucks, give or take. Rotors, realistically, about 40 bucks, give or take. So, in all actuality, your parts for this job are going to be not more than $200. And if you do it yourself, then labor is free, obviously. And really, you're saving right there, between $300 and $500 in labor at a shop. And like I said before, it takes 15 minutes per wheel. Once you take the wheel off, it's 2 bolts for your caliper. If you're changing your brake pads, that's it, 2 bolts. And 2 bolts for your brake caliper bracket. And that's what you have to remove to get your rotor off, which I'm going to show you here shortly. So 4 bolts, guys, please stop taking your cars to shops for brake jobs. You can do it yourself, and I'm going to show you how right now. Today we're working on this 2016 Dodge Ram 2500, and it's a friend of mine's, and he needed to change his rear brake pads and rotors, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to show people how easy it is to do so they don't take it to a shop and get charged $500. So in this case, this one is 13 millimeters for the caliper bolts. There's 2, there's one on the top, one on the bottom. You loosen those and then pry your caliper off with a screwdriver or pry bar, and then don't let it hang by the brake hose. Make sure you get like a bungee cord and just hang it up on the frame rail or something. And then you have, now if you're just changing brake pads, that's the extent of the teardown. All you have to do at that point is compress your caliper, which I'm going to show you in a minute how to do, and install your new brake pads. But since you're changing the rotor, you also need to remove the caliper bracket, which is, if I can get some lighting, this big bolt right here, which is a 21 millimeter. And once that comes off, then your rotor just slides right off the lug studs. So let's get into it. Alright, so now we've got the three main components of the brakes, and this works the same on the front as well. So you've got your caliper bracket right here. This is what we took off second, and that's what holds your brake pads. And then, of course, we've got the caliper, which is hanging up right here by a bungee cord, and the caliper bracket. That way there's no stress on the brake hose. And I just wanted to point out also, this is only on the rear, but this is where your emergency brake shoes are on mainly trucks. Cars, a lot of times they're set up this way, but they also can be, sorry, I don't even know where I'm pointing the camera. They can also be applied by the caliper itself, mechanically or electronically. But the reason I wanted to point that out is when you go to take off this rear drum, or this rear brake rotor, like I said, the drum is built into it, and you have to make sure your emergency brake is off. And I didn't film it, but we just had to beat this rotor pretty hard to get it off. And this truck has like 90,000 miles. This is the first brake job it's had, so you know, it may be easier on other vehicles that's had their brakes changed. But anyways, if you are replacing the rotor, you know, don't be afraid to hurt it. They're pretty strong, and they can take a beating. So here we have the new brake rotor next to the old one, and these old ones really weren't that bad, but like I said, it has 90,000 miles in their original, so it's time to replace them. The first thing you need to do before you put the new brake rotor on is soak it with brake parts cleaner. Rotors are shipped with a some type of coating on them. It's real like oily. It might just be a thin oil, I'm not real sure. And you know, that's just to keep them from rusting while they sit on the shelf or during shipping. So I like to soak the back of the rotor real good, and then slide it on, and then soak the inside of the rotor. Maybe. There it is. Don't be afraid to soak these down, because the brake parts cleaner is, you know, washing all that away. And if you don't have brake parts cleaner, it's really not safe, because your brake pads will, I mean, the rotors are covered in oil, and you know, they just won't have the same braking power. Also, they will be smoky for the first few miles and not smell very good. All right, let me show you Josh's rig here. So you have to compress the pistons on the caliper, and to do that, in this case, this is a 2-piston caliper. Some cars will have a 1-piston caliper, especially on the rear. But you need to use the old brake pad because it's thinner, and also you don't want to damage your new ones. And then, you know, put your C-clamp like that. Make sure it's on the body of the caliper and not on the you know, brake hose or the bolt for the brake hose. Sometimes those are mounted on the side of the caliper. But yeah, so now he's ready to go. Tighten that down. There is one thing I wanted to show before we do this that gets overlooked a lot of times. So when you push your brake pedal down, you're actually pushing brake fluid through the lines, and then that pushes the calipers out. Now, what that's doing is it's using brake fluid, and that comes out of your brake reservoir. And what a lot of people overlook is, you know, especially if you go get your oil changed at a business, they will, especially like Valvoline, for instance, or the dealership, they may top off your brake fluid, and honestly, if your brake fluid is this low, you can see his is down to the minimum mark, just above it. If your brake fluid is that low, that's a good indication that you need new brake pads, because the caliper has to be pushed out so far to make contact with the rotor. So when we push that brake caliper back in, you're going to see this brake fluid level rise. Now, if a shop or yourself has topped off your brake fluid before you got new brakes, when you turn that in, this brake fluid has nowhere to go. And I personally have never had this happen, but I've always been told to do this, so I do it just as a precaution. But before you compress that caliper, just take your brake cap off or just loosen it, and that'll give the brake fluid somewhere to go. Now in this case, no brake fluid's ever been added to this, it looks like, from the factory. So when he compresses that caliper, it's just going to fill this back up. But like I said, if you take your vehicle somewhere and get the oil changed and they've topped this off, make sure you do this, because when you compress that caliper, that fluid's going to fill this back up and it has to go somewhere, and you don't want to blow out seals. So right now Josh is compressing the piston, the caliper pistons back into the caliper. He's got the old brake pad right there, and obviously the reason for that is to push both pistons in at the same time. If you try and push one in, it'll actually push the other one out, so you can't do that. There they are, compressed. So another thing a lot of people overlook are these caliper slides. So your caliper bolts onto this slide, and as the brakes are applied, you know, the caliper moves in and out. And as you can see, let's see if we can zoom in on it. See the grease on this pin? This one's in really good shape, especially for being factory. But over time, you know, dirt and stuff does get in there, and sometimes those slides will be corroded so bad that they won't slide anymore, and that's actually what causes your brake pads to wear out prematurely, and or calipers, you know, because calipers stick at that point. But what I always do is I take these out. If there's any kind of corrosion at all, I take a wire wheel and clean them up really good, and then I use the disc brake quiet, or you can also use just like wheel bearing grease, just any kind of grease to grease them up and then reinstall them. Make sure you do that. This is a major key and will make your brakes last way longer. So one thing that's overlooked when doing brake pads at home, and I'm sure some shops do this also, is to lubricate the back of the pads. And this right here is actually a major cause of squealing when you hit your brakes. Especially, I mean, I've put brand new brakes on and didn't do this in my early years of working on vehicles, and they immediately were still, you know, making a little bit of noise, squeaking. And this right here is just a nice, you know, way to avoid that. Just a little bit of lubrication. And this stuff is CRC disc brake quiet, and it can be bought at any auto parts store. One more thing to point out before he slides the brake pads on is your slides right here. This is what your brake pad sits in and slides. These are in really good shape. They still look new. If you buy the more expensive brake pads, they come with them. But if these are corroded, make sure that you clean those up with a wire wheel also, and maybe even apply a little bit of grease so your brake pads can slide freely. Also, what I've had to do before is sometimes brake pads don't fit in here very well. Make sure your brake pads move, you know, by hand, that you can move them back and forth. And if not, you can take a grinder and just trim the edges down of this right here, and that'll make it slide better. So if you are watching this video and you plan on changing your brake pads, you probably already know this, but also wanted to point out to make sure that you do your lug nuts in a cross pattern. You don't want to do them in a circle, and Josh is going to show you that right now. And then what I like to do on an 8-lug vehicle, I mean, you know, any vehicle really, is after you do the cross pattern, I like to start at maybe the top one, and then in a clockwise motion, go back and torque all of them just to make sure you didn't overlook one, because I have done that before. All right, last step is pumping the brake pedal. You're not bleeding the brakes. All you're doing is getting the pistons inside of that caliper pushed back out to where your brake pads are making contact with the rotor. So just keep pumping the brake until it's stiff, and it looks like he's got it.